Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Ronald Gruner. Last name is spelled Gruner. And he's just published a book in January 11th, 2022. Really a fascinating book, a timely book. Title of it is We the Presidents, How American Presidents Shaped the Last Century. And Mr. Gruner founded and served as a chief executive of 3 successful technology firms during his long career. Unlike many technology firms, each company delivered a healthy financial return to its investors. Alliant went public in 1986, while shareholder.com and Sky Analytics were profitably acquired by major public corporations in 2006 and 2015, respectively. Mr. Gruner's experience as an accomplished executive has resulted in a different breed of presidential history. Taken from his business experience, this book, We the Presidents, focuses on results rather than politics, on economics rather than ideology, and on the interconnections linking presidential administrations rather than isolated presidencies. And his website is his full name, www.richardgruner.com, and you can reach him there. But this book was really an interesting read, and I found it to be very timely, watching a lot of the financial problems that the U.S. is in right now, but he can talk more about that. So, Richard Gruner, thanks for agreeing to the interview.
And William, just a small correction. That's Ronald Gruner.
Ronald, sorry.
That's okay. I've been called worse.
Okay. Ronald, sorry about that. I apologize. For people who may not have heard of you, this is your first book. Can you kind of talk about your background and what led you to come from a very successful technology career to writing We the Presidents?
Oh, I'd be happy to, William, and thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to chatting with you. Yes, I spent over 40 years in technology firms, and 35 of those years I was a chief executive of, as you mentioned, 3 companies in high technology. And as a chief executive, and more importantly, perhaps as an engineer, which I think of myself more as an engineer than I do a chief executive, you really have to be objective in how you look at the situations and try to look at the facts, not the ideology. I retired about 7 years ago and spent a lot of time chatting and kind of reacquainting with friends all over the country. I have kind of an interesting background. I grew up in Oklahoma, one of the reddest of the red states, and I spent most of my life in Massachusetts, where the computer industry was at the time, one of the bluest of the blue states. So I've got friends in Massachusetts, friends in Oklahoma, and almost everywhere in between. And I have found there was a lot of dissension and even distrust and perhaps even animosity between friends in Oklahoma and friends in Massachusetts. So I felt maybe something I could contribute would be to write a book that focused on the presidents and the decisions they made, their policies, and the time frames they lived in, and look at it strictly based on, from my perspective, what the facts were, and look at it objectively. So I've written a book that includes the last 100 years and 17 presidents, and nowhere in that book do I mention politics. The words Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, left, right are never mentioned. Instead, I try to talk on the issues about how presidents made decisions on the economic issues, on whether or not the country should be involved internationally, whether we should move towards providing universal health care, or whether that was a bad idea. That's what I focused on, but not the politics. And that's what motivated me to write this book. I just make one other comment. This is my first book. People think that's kind of astonishing, but actually, I have to say, for those of you that might be thinking about a book out there, it's not as difficult as you might think, particularly if you're writing a nonfiction book, because today, everything is available over the web. Whereas if you were to write a presidential biography 15 years ago, you would have to basically travel around the country, going to the presidential libraries, going to the Library of Congress, and all the different government bureaus to access those books and that data physically. Now you can do that all online and do the research on presidents going back 100 years or more online, and do it very, very efficiently. So it wasn't as difficult as some people might have thought.
But you really go kind of really in detail on each of these presidents, their decisions, the challenges that the country was facing, starting with Warren Harding. Can you kind of talk about the background that led up to the Harding presidency and some of the things that he was confronted with?
Well, first of all, let me just point out that Warren G. Harding took office in 1921, lived 2.5 years, died of a heart attack, and died in 23. He ran, surprisingly, on the first time on the slogan "America First." That was his campaign slogan in 1920. He's also focused on a secondary slogan was a return to normalcy. And the reason for that is that he inherited the presidency from Woodrow Wilson, who was very much an activist in many areas. And the United States had just come out of two really difficult times. One was World War I, where in only 18 months, the nation lost 117,000 soldiers in horrible trench warfare in Europe. And then after that, the Spanish flu came out in 1918 through roughly 1920. That killed 650,000 people. So almost 1 million Americans died in a country that was much smaller than we are today. So Harding inherited a very difficult time, both emotionally for people, but also the country had fallen into a very deep depression, taxes very high, and his job was to return to normalcy, which frankly he did a very good job of.
Right. And you kind of go in detail in the book about some of the economic issues, but he was curious because he had kind of a mix of in his administration of very competent and not so competent. Can you talk kind of about his challenges?
Yes, he hired both very, very well and very, very poorly. Let's take the poorly side first. He had what was called the Ohio Gang. Harding was from Marion, Ohio, and he brought in all of his old golf buddies and cronies and drinking buddies, frankly, and poker buddies that he socialized with every week, a couple of times a week, actually, playing poker. And many of those were in the cabinet, frankly, like Dougherty, his attorney general. They basically began, as soon as they got into office, extorting oil companies for bribes and doing a number of things to enrich themselves. Harding was never involved in that. And that scandal really did not come out. Those scandals, the most notable being something called Teapot Dome, where the Secretary of Interior simply took bribes to give two oil companies, including Sinclair, which is still around today, exclusive access without bidding for oil reserves in Wyoming. That was Teapot Dome. But on the other side, on the very positive side, he hired a number of very strong cabinet members, and I just mentioned two that affect us even today. One is Herbert Hoover, and I'll talk about him in a second, and the other is Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury under Harding and then also under Coolidge, and of course became president after Coolidge. Andrew Mellon was the first Treasury Secretary to talk about changing the way we look at taxation. And his idea, he called it scientific taxation, was that by reducing tax rates, which at the time were over 70%, that by reducing tax rates, you could actually collect more tax revenues because the wealthy would not be avoiding taxes. Those reduced tax rates would allow money to flow into the hands of individuals and corporations to invest in business, and the economy would boom, and the government would have more tax revenues. Now, today we call that supply side economics. Supply side economics. It was Andrew Mellon in 1921 that pioneered that idea. It was revolutionary at the time. The other person he brought in was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce. And during the 1920s, under Harding and under Coolidge, he was extremely successful, basically promoting business in many, many respects, promoting standards that allowed business to grow, and essentially leaving the government hands off of business and letting business grow at its own rate. Laissez-faire capitalism almost at the time, and it was very successful. What happened with Hoover and Mellon too is starting in 1929, when the Great Depression began, they maintained their same policies of essentially hands-off government. And when the Depression got so steep that employment was at 24%, people just were not investing. Companies were not investing. People were not spending. Everybody was afraid. And somebody had to come in and basically kind of jumpstart the economy, prime the pump, so to speak. Hoover was not willing to do that as president. And he got advice from counsel from Andrew Mellon to let these banks and companies fail. That calls out the weak, the stronger will survive. But that was tough medicine. It didn't work. And that was one of the tragedies of Herbert Hoover. After a very successful business career in the 1920s as a cabinet member, he was not as a president.
Right. They called him the Wonder Boy, super active. He seemed to be all over the place. He was independently wealthy, but his presidency wasn't seen as very successful addressing the economic challenges of that time. Would you agree?
Oh, I agree. And that's just an example that you can't follow the same methodology in every single situation. And I just elaborate on that just a bit. One of my realizations I had writing this book is that there's no single economic approach that is universal. That's the only way to run a country. I mean, economically, there a lot of different philosophies. There's demand side economics or Keynesian economics, where the government invests during difficult times and then increases taxes to pay off the debt during good times. That's Keynesian economics. There's supply side economics I mentioned. They're the monetarists, and everybody has their own philosophies, but they're not unique, and they all have their own useful point at different points in time. You just can't take one maniacally and say, this is the right approach. And of course, today we have that kind of attitude where we've got moneyed interests promoting different perspectives and saying this is really the only way you can conduct economic policy. That's wrong. And that was Hoover's mistake. He had an idea that worked in the 1920s. It failed badly during the Great Depression.
Right. And it was his own philosophy. He rejected government activism, which kind of led to his decline in popularity, whereas Roosevelt took a completely different approach, correct?
That's correct. Let me just say one more positive word about Herbert Hoover. I believe it was 1924, Hoover wrote a book called American Individualism. And in that book, he promoted the idea of the rugged individual. And it's the rugged individual that's highly motivated. That's the essence of America and American exceptionalism. And to a great extent, the Libertarian Party has adopted his principles and the idea of individual liberty, which is really core to many thinkings of Americans and American exceptionalism. That was really Herbert Hoover's contribution in many respects today.
Right. So I'm sorry. Please continue.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, William.
No, please continue on that thought.
I was just, you mentioned Roosevelt, and you're right. I mean, I'm old enough to have my mother have told me how when she was about 9 years old, how they listened on the radio, their family, during the height of the Depression in a small tumbleweed town in Texas, broke, listening to the radio and hearing Roosevelt's speech about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And what he did is he basically went in and said, we're going to figure out a way to get this country out of this situation. And if companies won't hire, which they were not, then we will, the government will, and we're going to put people to work. And that was extremely successful in the 1930s. Some people criticize that notion today, but that worked very well. And the gross domestic product, the economy from 1934 to 1940, before World War II, grew at the fastest pace of any time in the last 100 years because of Roosevelt's policies.
No, it's incredible. He was you write in your book, he was the largest employer at the time was him, the government. And people branded him with these labels, socialist, traitor, but he solved the problem, right? So
he did solve the problem. And the notion of calling him a socialist, you can see that wasn't true, because once World War II began in 1941, many of those agencies he formed, like the WPA, put so many people to work, those were all disbanded because they weren't needed anymore, because people had jobs in industry, the defense industry. He did not nationalize the defense industry. He could have easily made the argument, we've got to nationalize these companies for the national defense. He did not do that. They would allow to continue as private companies and even make a small profit.
Right. No, it's really remarkable. And there was massive legislation that he passed that really changed the whole legal infrastructure of this country, like 15 major pieces of legislation. Can you talk about that?
Well, that's many of those 15 pieces are passed in the first 100 days of his administration. Nobody set a better record of getting legislation passed than Roosevelt in his first 100 days. Of course, he had huge margins in Congress. And the expression at the time was, legislation isn't passed, it's simply saluted as it sails past Congress, because it went through so quickly.
Right. Amazing. And I think one of them was the Glass-Steagall Act. There was reforms in the banking and finance industry that are still around today.
Well, Glass-Steagall isn't completely around. Glass-Steagall basically said investment banks, these are banks that sell stocks and basically speculate in stocks and bonds. They won't loan you money to buy a house or provide credit cards. These are big investment banks like a Morgan Stanley and a Goldman Sachs today. Glass-Steagall essentially said investment banks have to be separated from commercial banks that do business with consumers, can't make loans to mortgages and things of that nature. Glass-Steagall pretty much got disbanded in the late 1990s. And that was one of the reasons, I believe, for the collapse in 2008, when there was so much financial speculation on home mortgages. as opposed to having a local banker make decisions as to who to get mortgages. And very conservative, you had a lot of these Wild West cowboy investment banks getting involved, or shadow banks getting involved, taking too much risk, and everything collapsed in 2008, as you know.
Right. So there was also the FDIC, though, which is very important, supporting banking. So people put their money back in the banks. Like, he made very clever policies to get the U.S. back on track. And
Yeah, you mentioned the FDIC, and you're so right about that. Back before Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, if a bank went bust and you had $10,000 in the bank, that money just disappeared. It was gone. It disappeared for you, and it disappeared out of the money supply. And so basically, and because banks that went out of business couldn't insure that, basically the government put in an insurance company, which is the FDIC, that today insures about $250,000. If the bank goes out of business, you can collect up to $250,000 through that insurance. And so that made people willing to go back in and put their money back in banks, and that allowed banks then to loan that money to begin to rebuild the country. It was kind of a two-step process.
And you'll still see that stamp today. Some people don't know where it comes from, but it goes back to Roosevelt. You'll still see that on banks or bank advertisements.
Oh, of course. Banks brag about that. The FDIC insured.
Right. No, it's incredible. And there were interesting things that I didn't know about. There's a lot of history in this book. The Townsend Plan, Epic Clubs, Swope Plan. There's a lot of things that I didn't know that ideas were fermenting about how to solve some of them.
Well, that's a very fascinating time. We're talking about from roughly 1931 to 1935. And there were all these ideas from Townsend, from Upton Sinclair, who was running for governor in California. That was called the Epic Plan. Huey Long had a plan. The idea was, look, companies have failed, people are starving. The government needs to provide some minimum compensation. We call that now universal basic income, which is up for discussion again. And there were lots of plans around that area. The reason for that is many people, somewhat understandably, believed capitalism had failed because unemployment was almost 25%. The companies had drawn in their horns, were not investing, weren't hiring people, and people were starving. If you ever saw the movie The Grapes of Wrath, you know what we're talking about here. It was terrible.
Hoover Towns, Hoovervilles, or whatever. Yeah.
What's that?
Oh, it's Hoover. They had those Hoovervilles, like shanty towns.
Hooverville and the Okies going from Oklahoma, where I happen to be from, to California, and just the starvation that many people were suffering from. Now, it's interesting. One of his other major contributions, Roosevelt's, perhaps the contribution that, of course, is most well known today, was Social Security. That idea was that basically when people get to 65, it will give them some minimum amount of income through Social Security, where they'd be somewhat self-supporting and wouldn't be in poverty. Now, that idea didn't come from some socialist. That idea came from the president of General Electric, Gerald Swope. Gerald Swope had a lunch meeting with Roosevelt, I believe in late 1933, where he proposed an idea he had proposed to Hoover, and Hoover rejected it, that the government get involved and provide a form of insurance and disability insurance and a pension plan, which came to be known as Social Security. So the idea for Social Security came from Gerald Swope, the president of General Electric, because he felt something had to be done.
Right. So it came from kind of the business community, which is interesting. It didn't come from maybe social activists or something like that. But the war happened, like you stated earlier. The war was upon us, 1941. Everything kind of changed, but then Roosevelt unfortunately passed away, and right into his fourth term, right?
Yeah, he I think he was 82 days into his fourth term, died on April 12th, 1945, unexpectedly, but he was, in retrospect, in poor health, and it should not have been that unexpected. But he had been president and such a huge presence in the United States, people probably thought he'd live forever.
And so this gets handed, the situation of the kind of finalizing Pacific War gets handed off to Truman. Can you talk about the challenges Truman faced and maybe some of the economic issues post-war?
Well, Truman wasn't very popular with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt only brought Truman in at the last minute in the 1944 election because his current VP, Henry Wallace, was not doing well politically. So he basically, I can say, dumped Henry Wallace and brought in Harry Truman. Truman got no briefings of any kind, only did not know about the atomic bomb, for example, did not know about Roosevelt's ideas for the post-war recovery. And so when he became president in April of 1945, he had really no preparation at all. And the first decision he had to make was how to end the war with Japan, because the war with Germany was rapidly ending and ended early in May, but Japan was still going on fighting. And the feeling was it would take a massive invasion of Japan itself, costing perhaps 1 million casualties, to bring Japan to a surrender. So he had to decide whether or not to use the atomic bomb. And I talk about it extensively in my book. There's a number of pages devoted to that. But the long and short of it is he decided the best way to end the war quickly and save the most lives was to make a statement to Japan that we have a bomb that's so powerful, you have no choice but to surrender. And that's what happened. It took 2 bombs to do that. But after the second bomb, Japan surrendered quickly, urged by the Emperor Hirohito. And that was a decision that still debated today. But I think if you look at all the facts and the fact that Japan would not agree to an unconditional surrender, I think Truman made the right decision. It was a very difficult decision. And then, of course, he had to decide at the end of the war what to do with Germany and Japan. And he was lobbied very strongly by members of his cabinet, particularly a fellow by the name of Henry Morgenthau, who at the time was the Department of State, basically said, turn Germany into an agricultural state. Basically, do not allow it to rebuild its industry, just allow it to raise crops. And that word had got out 6 months before the end of the war, and Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, took that and really basically motivated the soldiers by saying the America wants to turn Germany into a giant potato patch, which nobody wanted. But anyway, after the war, Truman disregarded Morgenthau's advice, replaced Morgenthau with George Marshall as Secretary of State, and they made the decision, what we have to do is we have to rebuild Germany, we have to rebuild Japan, and basically turn them into friends of the West, so to speak, and basically friends of democracy and capitalism. And because of Truman and the policies he put in place, we did that, and we did that very, very well. Unfortunately, we've not done that well, obviously, in the Middle East. That's something we perhaps can talk about in a few minutes.
Right. So, I mean, they're talking about the economy of the post-war world. What was Truman's kind of domestic policies, and how did he address the kind of challenges in the U.S. homeland?
Well, at the time, the nation still believed that the national debt was something that had to be worked down as quickly as possible. So after the United States came out of the war in 1945, we had about 18 months of relatively high inflation. Now, by high, I mean, as I recall, 6 to 8%, but then it damped down pretty quickly. What Truman did is, rather than cutting taxes after the war, which had risen significantly, he kept those taxes high with the objective of paying off as much of the national debt as possible. And he paid off a significant amount of that debt during his essentially 8 years in office. That was a key part of his policy. Now, because there was so much pent-up demand from the war, the economy boomed, although many people didn't expect it to. Top economist Paul Samuelson thought the economy would tank after the war. It did not. It boomed as soldiers came back and married, and we had the baby boom, and we had the GI Bill sending soldiers to college, getting educated, and coming into good jobs. Things just went very well. Truman did a good job in that respect.
Right. So, I mean, I think that the post-war was really kind of a fresh start in a lot of ways, and he led to the great General Eisenhower. Can you talk about Eisenhower and what he did as far as his administration?
Well, the first thing Eisenhower did was he basically negotiated an armistice, a ceasefire with North Korea. He did that within 6 months of taking office. The remarkable thing about Eisenhower, even though he was a general and had been in the military his whole career, after Korea, during his 8 years as president, only one American soldier died, and that was killed by a sniper in Lebanon. And even though there were many, many issues going on in the Middle East and in Asia that could have precipitated the United States getting involved, Eisenhower chose not to. And he took the policy that negotiation and diplomacy is better than going into battle, and he kept us out of war for 8 years. Now, one thing Eisenhower did that was unfortunate. is during World War II, he had a great success with covert operations through the OSS, which is the predecessor to today's CIA. And so when Winston Churchill came to Eisenhower in 1953 and said, look, the Iranians have just nationalized our oil company. We're in this big debate about oil profits, and they nationalized the company, and we need to do something to turn the government over. He had made that approach to Truman. Truman rejected that. But Eisenhower said, okay, we see what we can do to help, because they had been war allies. And so Eisenhower took up the idea of using a covert operation under the CIA, as had been done so successfully in World War II, to basically overturn the government, the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953. And that was, in my opinion, the beginning of our unfortunate involvement in the Middle East, which we're seeing the effects of today. And many people in the Middle East still remember how the United States got involved so covertly starting in 1953.
Right. I mean, there was a lot of challenges, but there was always in the background of his administration the Cold War, communism, and the threat internationally and domestically. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, the whole Red Scare was going on. That was during the period of Joe McCarthy, where there was a great concern that communists had infiltrated all through the government and industry, academia. And there was some good reason for believing that, because after World War II, literally dozens of spies were uncovered in the defense industry that were feeding secrets to the Soviet Union. So there was truth in that. But they had not really propagated into Hollywood and into the government and academia at the level that Joe McCarthy had suggested. Nobody went to jail, even though he had pursued that for something like 4 years. They found nobody, although it was very difficult. The other thing that's interesting about Eisenhower is he's famous for, his idea was to build a federal highway system, the interstate highway system across the country. He had seen the Autobahn of Germany, was very impressed with that. But that was a big, big fight. And he had a fight with the truckers union, which you'd think would be supporters of better highways. But at the time, the truckers were very, very skeptical that would work. And they were concerned about a 2 or 3 cent increase in gas taxes. And so they were very, very much against the interstate highway system initially. The other were people that were just feeling that the United States, starting with Social Security, was creeping towards socialism and communism, and that the interstate highway system that Eisenhower was proposing would be creeping communism. And he was accused of being a socialist and even a communist by the John Birch Society for promoting a federal system called the interstate highway system. But he got around that by changing the name to the defense highway system and claiming the highway system was not just for consumers and civilians, but was critical if we were ever attacked, to be able to allow military transports to move quickly around the country. And that basically broke that log jam.
And he was kind of one of the first there were very prevalent civil rights challenges under his administration as well, correct?
Yeah, that's true. I'll use a phrase that may offend some people, but if you had to read the book to get the context, in many respects, Eisenhower was a well-meaning segregationist. And I don't want to offend anybody on that, but he had grown up in the Deep South, had only seen segregated society all through the military, at West Point, at Augusta Golf Club, everywhere. So he was personally against moving too quickly to desegregate. But when Truman basically signed an executive order to desegregate the military, they drugged their feet during Truman's administration, but Eisenhower did that quickly, desegregated the military. And then when schools began to desegregate, after Plessy versus the Little Rock High School lawsuit in 1954. In 1957, he sent in federal troops to facilitate that integration and began to integrate schools across the United States. That was a courageous move on his part, because in many parts of the United States, that was very, very unpopular.
Right. And he also kind of had his administration was much more business oriented as opposed to political. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, Eisenhower had never joined a political party. And when in 1950, 51, 52, when he was being considered a candidate to run for president, both political parties were actively campaigned to have him join their party. He eventually elected to join the Republican Party, but he never really felt a member of a political party, and focused on, like I said, the issues and building business and keeping the bringing the national debt down as quickly as possible, and issues like that.
Right. So he was kind of a maintenance, and then he had his 8 years, and we come to somebody who's a Republican to a Democrat, right? John F. Kennedy. Can you talk about that transition and how John F. Kennedy was doing?
Well, the economy actually grew very well during the 50s, except for the last 2 years where it fell under recession in 58 and 59 and 60. And so John Kennedy ran on the idea, let's get the country moving again. Okay. And you hear that often from presidential candidates. Former President Trump ran on the idea of make America great again, which is somewhat similar. Let's get the country moving again. And so Kennedy was in contrast to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was in his 60s at the time, somewhat grandfatherly. And John Kennedy was young, 43, as I recall, very vigorous, had a beautiful family. And it was for many people, a breath of fresh air and high energy coming to the presidency in contrast to Eisenhower.
Right. And so what were the things that, Kennedy had tons of international challenges and squabbles within his administration, correct?
Well, the first challenge he had was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Eisenhower administration, I beg your pardon, that was the Bay of Pigs issue, the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the Eisenhower administration was planning an invasion of Cuba, a covert invasion to look like Cuban nationalists were doing that. And essentially, Kennedy got talked into that by the general staff the first few months of his administration. Of course, that was a disaster. Kennedy took full responsibility for that, saying that success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. And he was right about that. And then he had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where 6 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis became an issue, the United States and NATO had put missiles into Turkey and perhaps Italy, but Turkey for sure, which threatened the Soviet Union, retaliated by putting missiles into Cuba. And so we had the crisis. And Kennedy handled that well. He came out of that basically viewed as a major international leader, very successful. Now, in my book, I talk about the backstory, which is very interesting. And that the Department of State papers have been released, and the correspondence, and there were something like 30 interchanges during that short 10-day period, quite interesting. And that essentially Khrushchev, would have surprised many people, basically took Kennedy under his wing and proposed how to end that. And Khrushchev, very early into that situation, said, look, we'll take our missiles out of Cuba promptly if you take yours out of Turkey, and you don't have to announce that to the American people because that might be a loss of face. You don't have to mention that. And also if you promise never to invade Cuba. And so Kennedy promised to do that. The missiles came out and Kennedy was a hero. And 2 years later, Khrushchev was kicked off the Politburo.
Wow. So Khrushchev was gone, and then Kennedy gets assassinated. And then Lyndon Johnson, kind of a whole different character, different administration, different policies started with him, right?
That's correct. Well, it didn't stop with him because in 63, after Kennedy was kind of getting his footing after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Bay of Pigs, he was actively promoting an aggressive civil rights program. He was promoting an aggressive tax cut. He was promoting an aggressive social program also. And Lyndon Johnson essentially picked those up, and I'll say somewhat out of sympathy after Kennedy's assassination. Of course, Johnson was a great legislator, got much of that legislation passed, which had originally started under Kennedy in 1963. The Kennedy tax cut, even though that was passed in 64 under Johnson, it's still called the Kennedy tax cuts. And much of the civil rights legislation that Lyndon Johnson passed was promoted by Kennedy in 1963, as were loosened and changed immigration laws.
Right. There was an immense amount of change in those early days of Johnson. Those are still with us.
Of course, the other thing that Johnson inherited from Kennedy was the Vietnam situation. Kennedy had begun to put troops and, well, let's call them advisors, into Vietnam in 63, and that was increasing. And then the whole thing basically exploded during 1964 under Johnson, and that was what really destroyed Johnson's administration and broke his heart. The whole situation with Vietnam, he couldn't figure out how to extricate himself from.
Right, and he decided not to run for president again. So that was like real strange changes administration sensibilities, from Kennedy's assassination to John. Very unusual for a political person to refuse more power. So I was curious.
Well, if you read his biography, his autobiography, his heart was broken with what happened in Vietnam and the number of deaths, and he could not find a way to get the United States out of that honorably. Honorably being where we didn't totally retreat, and he would be blamed as a communist sympathizer. And of course, that was the first knee-jerk reaction whenever you're not playing hardball with the communists back in the 50s and 60s.
Right. I mean, there's those accusations goes back to Roosevelt too, or being a socialist or whatever.
That's correct.
We're kind of at about 35 minutes. There's a lot more in this book. You come up to the present age. When people get We the Presidents, what else can they expect as you kind of analyze the presidents from Johnson through Nixon to all the way to the present with Donald J. Trump?
Well, I have to say, writing the book was, I really enjoyed writing the book. It was very enlightening to me how much past presidents affect today's events. And there's probably a dozen major issues that are highlighted in the book that affect us today one way or the other. I'll just give you one. The top of the news right now is Ukraine, as we all know. And if you look at the situation in Ukraine, that return of the Cold War and those tensions between East and West were predicted by the top diplomats in Washington, particularly a fellow by the name of George Kennan in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO had to decide what to do, including disband itself. It chose not to, and chose to basically move eastward and court the former Warsaw Pact countries and to begin to threaten Russia's borders in the late 1990s. In 1999, they made Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic members of NATO, which was a great threat to Russia. Russia began investing in defense spending, which had fallen like a rock for 10 years. And as George Kennan predicted in my book, it's in the Clinton chapter, there's quite a bit of discussion about that. We're exactly in the situation that was predicted by diplomats if NATO is allowed to expand eastward to threaten Russia, because Russia had been invaded by the Germans in, as you know, the early 1940s. Russia lost something like 25 million people. And before that, that's still very much part of the Russian psyche by Napoleon in the early 19th century. So invasion from the West is something that Russia fears tremendously, and it drives much of their thinking. And that's one of the issues going on in Russia today. I'm not a Russian sympathizer. I'm just telling you what history says. And much of what we're dealing with in Ukraine today, those seeds were planted during the Clinton administration when NATO was allowed to expand eastward.
Right. And it's very important. And a lot of you have a very economic approach to all of your analyses and analysis of the different presidents and administrations. And we have a lot of economic issues today. So I think your book charts that course of all these difficult decisions that presidents had to make in economics. I mean, how do you see our situation right now economically in the context of what you learned putting this book together?
Well, the biggest concern I think people probably have right now, literally today as we speak, is probably inflation. And if you go back and look at some of the more credible journals over the last few years, that was predicted and understandable. The Fed had been pumping money into the economy very strongly since 2009. The money base has grown tremendously, the supply of money. And the classic definition of inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. So too few goods is the supply chain. So with what's happened with the pandemic, the supply chain's been greatly weakened. That's oil supplies, that's supplies coming from Asia, that's supplies coming even from our own factories, meatpacking plants, for example. So people have come out of the pandemic with pent-up demand, like after World War II. They want to buy things, they want to do things, they want to go out to eat, they want to travel, etc. And so the supply chains are weak, and so that's limiting supply, that's raising prices. And then all this money that's flowed into the economy has made money available, and people are bidding up prices. So today's inflation isn't something that you can blame one president for. This is something we've sowed the seeds for a long time, but in particular, the last few years during the pandemic. And it's going to take a while for that to work out.
Gotcha. So there's a lot of information in this book. It's very thoroughly researched and written. What would you like to add, or anything that I'd missed, or before we wrap this up? What was your kind of final comments?
Well, William, I think you've hit all the key points. I mean, one question I'm often asked is if there's one characteristic that you think characterizes the great presidents, I guess I would use the word resolve, because when presidents are faced with difficult issues that are unpopular, the presidents that really distinguished themselves had the resolve to see it through. Roosevelt, during the 1930s, saw war coming, a world war perhaps, and believed he could not allow Germany to overtake Europe. So he basically helped England during the war through the Lend-Lease programs, and that was extremely unpopular with most of the Americans from 1935 on until Pearl Harbor. He did that. When when General MacArthur was fighting the North Korean War, went into North Korea, and then went to the Chinese border and wanted to go into China with nuclear weapons, Truman fired him on the spot after MacArthur went around Truman to Congress trying to get support from Congress. And that was a brave decision. That hurt Truman tremendously. And a more recent one is Jimmy Carter. I mean, Jimmy Carter promoted the idea of energy conservation, which threatened many people because it was saying we've got to reduce our oil consumption. We've got to reduce our energy consumption per capita, because it had been growing 1.2% for 50 years. It's unsustainable. And people made fun of him because of his cardigan sweaters and all that. But today, energy consumption per capita is down 15% relative to 1978. It's conservation, not energy production, which has made us largely energy independent. So I think Carter gets credit for that.
Interesting. Well, there's a lot more in this book, and where's the best place to get this? Do you get it at Amazon or your website?
Well, you can start with your local independent bookstore. They all have access. If they don't have it on the shelf, just tell them to order We the Presidents. They can get that in a few days. If you want to order online, of course, there is Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and you can always visit our website, wethepresidents.us, for more suggestions. That's wethepresidents.us.
We the President. I'll put that in the show notes. We the Presidents. Presidents.us, and then your website is ronaldgruner.com, right?
Yes, so, that's correct. And that goes directly at this point to wethepresidents.us.
Okay, I see. I get it. Okay, so that feeds into the wethepresidents.us. And if people want to reach out to you or ask you any questions, is your website the best place, or social media?
The best place to find me is at Gruner.com. I'm sorry for the various sites. And I have to put a link in. Matter of fact, do this. Go to wethepresidents.us, and by tomorrow morning, there'll be a way to reach me. Wethepresidents.us, and there'll be a way to reach me tomorrow morning.
Awesome. Really fascinating discussion. Great book. Very timely. People can learn a lot of important aspects of American history, economic history as well. Title of the book, again, is We the Presidents, How American Presidents Shaped the Last Century, by Ronald Gruner, published January 11th, 2022. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, William. Enjoyed chatting with you.
Cool. Likewise. Stay there. Okay, perfect. That was great. So